Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the EkaShri Schools of Yoga podcast. And like we've been mentioning over the last couple of months at this point, the podcast goal is to really be able to take a couple key topics that we think are interesting enough from a yoga and just a more holistic toolkit perspective and have a discussion around what the main goals of these particular topics are and how we can think about the practical applications of these topics when we think about our yoga practice, or even just more broadly, as we think about just going through the motions of life, how we can think about bringing these concepts in. So today we have a pretty exciting topic planned around the concept of meditation. And so Shriramji, thank you again for being here today. So maybe why don't we just start with holistically the concept of meditation, and maybe just if you can touch upon from our previous podcast, we had discussed a little bit around why we meditate and why we should think about meditation. So maybe why don't we start there, and then we can get into the next series of points around delving into this topic in a little bit deeper way.
Thank you, Vedantji. In fact, meditation is perhaps the heart of yoga. Meditation is perhaps the central discipline or a central practice in yoga. And we can think of all the other practices, such as practices for the body, the postures, and the practices for the breath, such as the pranayama. They're all preparations for this main event, which is meditation. Because recall that the goal of yoga is to transform the mind, the inner space. Yogaha chitta vritti nirodha is what Patanjali says. So the activities of the mind, when we are able to bring tranquility to it, in other words, transform a restless mind to a tranquil mind, transform a scattered mind to a one-pointed mind, and transform an up and down mind when it goes through extremes, transform that to a stable mind, equanimous, equilibrium state of mind. So these three inner transformations is what yoga is all about. This is what we are seeking. And in this context, meditation plays a very important part. In fact, it is the central practice in yoga. And what meditation is, the way Patanjali describes in the Yoga Sutras, we have seen it before, but a brief summary is when the mind is so quiet that the scenery in the mind is the same across time. There are no agitations or restlessness in the mind where the scenery, the pratyaya, the Sanskrit word that Patanjali uses is pratyaya. The scenery, the snapshot of thoughts in the mind does not change from one moment to the next. Pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam is the sutra that Patanjali says that the scenery is still. It's like a still surface of a lake, and in the surface of a lake that is tranquil, we are able to see the depth of that lake. So we are connected to the depth of ourself. We are reposing in ourself when the mind is quiet. So when the mind is quiet, what happens is, rather than consuming energy in various thoughts, perhaps mundane or trivial thoughts that are dissipating all our mental energies, we are actually conserving the energy. So meditation helps to energize the system. The mind feels more alert, as against the mind feeling exhausted or deprived of energy, because we have been using up the mental resources for all kinds of thoughts, maybe anxious thoughts or stressful thoughts and so forth. So we can think of meditation as the journey from turbulence to tranquility. And meditation has so many benefits and beneficial experiences. For example, the experience of peace, of tranquility, of being at peace with oneself rather than being at conflict with oneself or with the situations and surroundings, etc. So these are some of the experiences that accrue over time with the practice of meditation.
Wonderful. I think that makes so much sense. So I think we touched upon the concept of meditation through this explanation, Shriramji, but maybe can we just think about the context of how that relates to dhyana, as well as what the correlation between the two is? Maybe if we can just spend a minute on that before we delve into our main topic for today. I think that'll help just level set for our listeners in terms of how to intertwine those two concepts and what the relationship really is.
Yes, in fact, the word dhyana is of course the seventh limb of Ashtanga Yoga, the seventh limb of the 8 limbs of yoga that Patanjali describes, and we usually translate the word dhyanam as meditation. So when we hear the word meditation, it's a very overloaded word. Perhaps different traditions or different people, when they use the word meditation, perhaps they refer to different things. Whereas in the context of yoga, the definition is very clear. So as I mentioned, the sutra where Patanjali describes what dhyana is, tatra pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam, when the mind is so still that the contents of the mind, the scenery in the mind remains the same from one moment to the next. That state of mind is called dhyanam. And so we understand conceptually what dhyanam is, but how to practicalize that? Perhaps in today's session, let us take the opportunity to see what practical tips, what are some keys that can unlock the power of meditation and enhance the quality of meditation and help us in the path where, especially when we take the intention to bring this practice in our daily life, what are the things we can do to enhance the quality of our practice?
Wonderful, wonderful. And with that, why don't we go ahead and, with that context, move on to what our main topic is for today, which is an interesting one, I think a little bit different. So the concept today is the 10 keys to meditation. And let's maybe, Shriramji, like we were talking before, why don't we go ahead and maybe let's do this in a way where we maybe just introduce each of these concepts, and then after each one, we can go ahead and have a little bit of sort of Q&A and discussion around each of these 10 topics just to crystallize it a little bit more. I think that'll just definitely be helpful from a perspective of our listeners, and even from my own perspective as well, just to be able to understand a little bit deeper what these concepts mean. So why don't we go ahead and start, maybe Shriramji, if you can just give us a quick overview on how do we come up with the 10 keys before delving into each of these one independently? Like, what exactly is the goal of these 10 keys to meditation? What should we think about as we're going through each one in terms of what they ultimately should be helping us achieve?
So the main objective of going through these 10 keys for meditation is to make this a practical experience. In other words, we can conceptually understand what meditation is. We have already seen the definition of meditation, so we have an idea of what it is. But how to put that in practice? And some of the tips that will help us to practicalize this teaching, this wisdom of meditation in our daily life. So that is how these 10 keys work. And I should also credit my teacher. So I've had the opportunity and blessing to learn from various teachers. And these 10 bullet points, the keys for meditation practice, I learned from one of my teachers. His name is Krishnaswamy Gopalan. And I've learned many practical aspects of how to apply the principles that we study in the yoga texts, in the Vedantic texts, how to put them in our practical situations, practical life. So these 10 points that we are going to discuss now, I learned from my teacher, Krishnaswamy Gopalan. So I would like to credit him for these 10 bullet points, and we will go over them one by one.
Wonderful. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start with the first point, Shriramji, which is the topic of consistency.
Yes. So the first key in meditation is consistency. That means we set a regular rhythm. The practice of meditation, we do it on a regular basis, ideally every day. Ideally, perhaps twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, perhaps, and set the rhythm. Every day, we honor our practice by doing it on a regular basis. So it is said that 20 minutes of daily practice of meditation is far superior to 2 hours of occasional practice. for example, 2 hours of weekly practice of meditation. So there is a power that builds up when we practice meditation every day rather than in a haphazard manner. So without offering a big break between our practices. As Patanjali says, Satu Dirgha Kala Nairantarya. Practicing for a very long time, several years, and the practice should be done without a break, without giving a gap between our practices. So how that helps is each time we sit for the practice of meditation, we are strengthening the habit of the mind to become still, to become tranquil. And in one of the previous sessions, we saw how there's a tug of war in the mind. There's a habit of the mind to be extroverted and to jump from different topics. So like a monkey mind, as they say, is jumping from one topic to another. And there's another tendency of the mind to repose in the self and be still. So these are two opposing tendencies of the mind. And by practicing meditation on a regular basis every day, we are actually strengthening the tendency of the mind to be quiet. And when we practice every day, we are also using the power of compounding. The effectiveness of today's meditation is built upon all the practices that we have done in the past up to this moment. So we are leveraging the power of compounding. So with compounding, we are able to make exponential growth in the practice of meditation rather than a linear growth. We are able to make progress in an exponential way. So that is the power of a consistent practice of meditation. And perhaps this is one of the most important keys in meditation, especially to be consistent in our practice, even though some days the mind may not come to that place of tranquility. We still persist with that practice without getting dejected or without getting miserable with the practice of meditation. Oh, I am still turbulent in the mind, it's not settling down. So rather than feeling bad about it, continuing with the practice with the trust, with the faith that in due course of time, the mind will become more and more quiet. So that is the secret, where we use the power of consistency to build up the power of meditation.
So Shriramji, on that, I think that makes a lot of sense. And intuitively, right, I think myself and the listeners probably know that, yeah, of course, consistency is going to need to be top of mind, right, in order to actually see the power of compounding the benefits of meditation, right? So that makes complete sense. Practically, I think towards the last point that you mentioned, right, around even if you feel you're in a position where the mind, maybe when you're going to do the practice for this given day is not in a good spot, or you feel very disturbed or mentally afflicted, how do you think about just making sure you end up just actually sitting down and doing the meditation and the practice, right? Because I think the natural human tendency here would be to say, if I'm like, have a very busy morning, or if I'm rushing around, or it's been a late night or something, the natural tendency I would think would be for us to then just say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to be productive if I do meditation today. My mind is going to be distracted. So it's just not worth me wasting the time to do it at all today. So how do you think about in those situations kind of building the fortitude to still say, okay, I'm still going to spend those 15, 20 minutes actually practicing, even if it's maybe not going to be the highest quality meditation that I'm going to actually be able to achieve. So how should we think about that from a practical perspective?
So that is a very good point. Sometimes when we are very busy, on days in which we are very busy, there might be a tendency to forego the practice of meditation, but that may not be a good idea. So let us remind ourselves that on days in which we are extremely busy and there are many demands that are placed on our time, that is when meditation can be most beneficial to us. That is when we need meditation the most. Because whenever we are very busy, and especially when we want to make very important decisions, or for example, write an exam or appear for an interview and so forth. So on those days, We want our mind to be at its peak, the mind to be tranquil, the mind to make quick decisions, the highest decisions. And that can happen only when the mind is in a place of peace, in a place of tranquility, in a place of alertness. And we can build up that state of mind when we practice meditation on that. So do not skip meditation when you need it most. So especially on those days, it is very helpful to meditate. And also remember that even though the mind might be jumping around, it may not settle down into a place of tranquility, it is good to have the trust in that process. In Sanskrit, the word they use is Shraddha. Shraddha means there is a trust in that process. Even though I don't see any visible results, the mind is still jumping around, but I know that inside there is some process that is happening within that perhaps I'm not aware of. And that will help me in the long term to allow the mind to settle down in a place of tranquility. It's like sowing the seeds, and before the seed sprouts, it takes some days perhaps. So before we see the evidence of the practice of meditation working, perhaps we need to have some patience. So just trust the process and keep doing it, although we don't see any visible evidence, especially in the beginning stages, especially in the first few days.
No, that makes sense, Shriramji. So thanks for explaining that. I think, part of the question was, it's kind of like a little chicken and egg kind of problem, right? Where you have to take that action of doing the meditation to help fix the problem. And the problem won't be fixed unless you actually go ahead and do the meditation, right? So it's a little bit of like circular logic, but I think at the same time for our listeners, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So anytime there's that, urge, like if you're busy or you don't feel like you're in the right mental state, still being able to just say, I'm going to spend, even if it's 10 minutes sitting down, just even honestly breathing, right? Even if it's not a full meditation, just breathing, I think is what's going to be important, because that consistency is then going to make it easier and easier to actually be able to get the benefits of that meditation going forward. So no, that makes a lot of sense, Shriramji. So thanks for sharing that. I know we have a lot to discuss in terms of the different topics here. So we can maybe think about delving into each of these a little bit deeper, because there's so many follow-ups. But moving on to the next topic, Shriramji, the second key, time. So why is time so important in the concept of meditation?
So there are certain times during the day when the mind is naturally quiet. And so the yogis who devote a lot of time for practicing yoga, yogis who value their yoga practices, they seize this opportunity. And one of the moments during the day where the mind is especially alert and especially easy to lend itself for meditation is during the sunrise time or even the sunset time. So during these twilight hours, mind has a natural tendency to settle down and be in a place of sattva or clarity. So when we go with the flow of the mind, the nature of the mind is to be more quiet during these times, perhaps the experience of meditation will be deeper. So especially when we begin the practice of meditation, when we practice it during these times, you will notice that the meditation is far deeper when we use the natural flow of time, especially when the mind is quiet at certain times, to seize that opportunity. And also, there's one more element to the aspect of time. So when we say choose the correct time for meditation, there is also rhythm in consistency of our time. For example, it is a good idea to practice meditation around the same time every day. For example, if we practice meditation, say 6:30 a.m. in the morning, then choose the same time the next day. Choose the same time because the mind becomes ready for meditation. We have trained the mind to be quiet at that hour, and naturally the mind will settle down, perhaps expecting the practice of meditation. It will naturally lend itself for the practice. So consistency in time as well helps in the practice of meditation.
That makes sense. And I think in an ideal scenario, Shriramji, right, that totally makes sense. And you want to pick the ideal time, have that be consistent, have that be something that you repeat and kind of build into your lifestyle or your schedule, if you will, over the course of the long term. So would you say, Shriramji, I think I know the answer to this, but maybe nevertheless, probably better to just make sure. But in the event that, let's just say, this is the ideal scenario to be in, right? Where you have this time of day, either sunrise, like you mentioned, when the mind is the cleanest, doesn't have that much going on, and create that consistency in your pattern of meditation over the course of the long term. But if you don't have those minutes, or let's just say you're someone, just making things up, that you're a big, you travel a lot, or you have maybe a very variable schedule at work, or something doesn't allow you to basically get that consistency, how should you then think about optimizing your personal life, your job life, your the time constraints? People will have kids, etc., right? Where getting those blocks of time and consistently getting that may not be easy for everyone. So if that's the case, how should one think about building in meditation into their daily schedules if that's not the easiest of things to do to get that consistency?
Yes, that's a great point. Perhaps we may not be able to choose the same time every day. So let me echo the words of my teacher verbatim. So he used to say that it is better to practice meditation at some time during the day rather than not doing meditation at all. So if you are not able to pick the same time every day, it's okay, but practicing meditation at some time that is convenient to you is far superior to foregoing the practice of meditation for that day because we were unable to choose the ideal time. So it doesn't matter, just pick a time. If you're unable to choose the same time every day, it doesn't matter, just pick some time during the day. So it's good to keep that also in mind sometimes, because when we realize, for example, when we are traveling, oh, my meditation time, I'm busy. That's not an excuse to skip meditation that day. Just find an alternate time where we are able to sit for meditation and give the body and mind the benefit of that practice that day.
No, I think that makes sense. And the reason I think I ask is because hopefully our listeners shouldn't view the need for, in an ideal situation, consistency and timing are going to be the best kind of variables to have under your control, right? To get this practice going. But hopefully, like you mentioned, Shriramji, if you don't have that time availability or that consistency, just doing it at some point during the day, right, to just build the habit and start getting into it, I think is better than hopefully thinking that, because I cannot get the consistency or because I cannot get the right time of the day, I'm just going to forego the practice altogether, right? So that's not what we're trying to advocate for here. So making sure you have some kind of a start, regardless of what time of the day is possible, I think is just the best way to go. And then, like you mentioned, Shriramji, right, in an ideal world, if you have and can make it work, then picking the time of the day, like the morning or stuff where the mind is the clearest, is going to be the best sort of environment temporally to pursue the practice of meditation. So that makes sense. And maybe number 3 kind of ties into this. I think this is a little bit self-explanatory, but place, right? So naturally, right, Shriramji, we want to have some kind of a space that we regard as maybe sacred towards our meditation practice, something that is clean and uncluttered, and something where we can be comfortable. That way we can focus entirely on the meditation and not have to worry about anything else. So maybe beyond those basics, Shriramji, would you have anything a little bit more subtle on the concept of place that's important when it comes to the practice of meditation?
So you use the perfect word, Vedanji. You said there's a sacred place. So there is importance or a value that we attach to that place where we sit for meditation every day. Make it sacred, because the moment we enter that place, when we physically enter that place, the mind automatically settles down in tranquility. Mind becomes peaceful. We experience a meditative state of mind just by walking to that space. And you are right, it is easier for the mind to settle down when there is uh, a clean environment, shaucha, as Patanjali says, shaucham, a clean place. And I've experienced this powerfully myself. For example, on days in which I take the time and effort to nicely clean the room, and the meditation that I do after cleaning that place is far deeper. There is, uh, when we unclutter the physical space, there is something in the mind that resonates as well. We are uncluttering the mind as well. So the physical space where things are arranged in a nice way and the physical space is clean. Shuchau deshe pratisthapya sthiramasana matmanaha is what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. Situating oneself in a clean place, it becomes easier for the mind to settle down in the practice of meditation.
And that makes sense, and I think something that our listeners hopefully will take into account. And I think once again, it's one of those things where depending on where you are, like ideally if you're doing the practice in the morning at home, then ideally you have some kind of a place where you do the practice where you can leave that place only for your meditation. Because if you leave that or regard that place as only for your meditation related practices, you will then naturally start to revere that as sort of a more sacred space, versus if you were doing multiple things in that particular space and you don't really associate it with meditation then. So I think that's something to also keep in mind. Next thing, Shriramji, is the fourth one, preparation. So can we talk a little bit about what practices are good preparation for entering meditation, and to what degree do we need to do that before doing meditation?
So you're right. This is another very important point, namely preparing before we sit for meditation. If we ignore the preparations and if we simply sit down with eyes closed, expecting a deep meditation to happen, perhaps our expectations get shattered because the mind has its momentum. There are so many thoughts, it doesn't settle down. So, preparations for meditation can be manifold. In the practice of yoga, in the Ashtanga Yoga, the preparations that can be done are the practice of asanas, and the practice of pranayama. Asanas or physical postures help the body to be stable. When we sit for meditation, after asanas, the body will not disturb you because the body is stable and the body is not restless anymore. It is stable and it is comfortable. Otherwise, if we don't prepare the body, 2 minutes into the meditation, we start becoming aware of the discomforts in the body, and that becomes an impediment. The mind doesn't settle down because it is trapped by the concerns of the body. So asanas help to bring lightness to the body. The Hatha Yoga Pratipika calls it angalagavam. That means the body feels so light that you forget the body. So the body doesn't disturb you. So that is one preparation. Another preparation is pranayama. In pranayama or breath work, what we do is to remove the curtain of lethargy or laziness, the curtain of tamas, the confusions and the feeling of mental clog. It goes away. It is replaced by clarity of mind. So when we enter the place of meditation, the mind is alert, mind is clear, the mind is not bogged down by lethargy or confusion. Sometimes when the mind feels heavy with lethargy, perhaps we fall asleep rather than meditate. And sleep is not meditation, you see. So in order for the mind to be alert during meditation, it's a good idea to practice pranayama. And in fact, it is also said that asanas, the practice of asanas, helps to reduce the rajogunam, the restlessness in the system. The practice of pranayama reduces tamogunam, the darkness or the mental fog, the lethargy is reduced. And when rajas and tamas come down, sattva automatically comes up. The clarity of mind, the brilliance of the mind automatically comes up. and it's the perfect launching pad to enter meditation. So those are preparations that we can do inside a yoga mat. There are also preparations that we can do outside the yoga mat. For example, being mindful of the food that we eat. If we overeat, then perhaps we are not setting the right foundation for meditation. If we overeat, perhaps we feel the heaviness and the dullness in the body and mind, and that becomes an impediment to meditation. So the preparations can also be outside the yoga mat. And even things like how we engage in day-to-day life. And that point we will come in a couple of moments. We will see how our living of our day-to-day life influence the depth of meditation, how deep we can silence the mind. So how we engage with the world. Are we kind to people, or the mind is filled with anger or rage? So that will negatively impact the quality of meditation as well. So all these are uh, something to keep in mind, how to prepare the mind for meditation. And there's one very beautiful sutra by Patanjali. He says, Virama Pratyaya Virama Pratyayabhyasa Purva Samskara Sheshonyaha. Virama Pratyaya Abhyasa Purva. So Virama means rest. When we want to give a deep rest to the mind, then it can be achieved by Abhyasa Purva, doing some preparatory or prior practices. Do some practices in order for the mind to settle down. And for those of us who have been to yoga classes, who have been regular with the practice of yoga asanas and pranayama, I'm sure you have had the experience that at the end of the practice, there is a natural quieting of the mind. Mind naturally settles down and it goes deep in relaxation. So we use the momentum that these practice create, where the mind automatically settles down. We seize this opportunity. Again, these are all several methods in which we seize this opportunity when the mind is naturally brought to a place of tranquility, and use that as a launching pad to enter meditation.
Wonderful. I think that makes a lot of sense, Shriramji. And I think in an ideal world, once again, right, having the preparation along the different Ashtanga yoga limbs that we've talked about is something that will be incredibly helpful to getting the most out of the meditation practice. And so I think to the extent that our listeners have the ability to build out a full, yoga daily personal curriculum for themselves, I think that introducing some kind of components within asanas and pranayama will be very helpful, as it will then allow you to just get the most out of the meditation practice, right? So to the extent that you have 30 minutes, maybe, for example, instead of spending 30 minutes on meditation, maybe it's worth spending 20 instead and doing 5 minutes of asanas and 5 minutes of pranayama, or you can play with the allocation of the timing between each of these as you wish, but having that at least in some way, shape, or form as a precursor towards your meditation practice is something that will be incredibly helpful and I think allow you to get the most out of it. So that makes a lot of sense. So moving on to the fifth thing, Shriramji, which is I think now starting to get into a little bit more of the intangible and abstract aspects of the keys to meditation. So how should we think about, naturally, if we're new to meditation and, we are just starting out, it's going to be very close to impossible to just, silence the mind immediately and immediately just be fully immersed with the meditation. So how should we think about kind of handling these thoughts that come in, and how should we think about silencing them to the extent possible in a way where it doesn't become harmful to ourselves, if that makes sense?
That's an excellent point, especially when we are tiptoeing into the practice of meditation. In our initial few days, we don't expect the mind to immediately settle down, because we have been encouraging the mind to extroverted thoughts. The mind is always projected outside, and for the mind to settle down, it takes some time. So the first few sitting of meditation, the mind will be jumping around. It is the nature of the mind, and there's nothing wrong with it. That is the natural state of the mind before we begin our daily sadhana of meditation. So the mind will keep wandering. We intend to go into this place of tranquility, to experience this place of tranquility, but the mind will jump around. It will happen. So, how do we deal with that? Rather than getting discouraged by it or depressed about it, thinking that, oh, I've been practicing meditation for the last 20 days, the mind is still jumping around. I don't think I'm fit for it. Rather than having these kind of thoughts, how do we handle these thoughts? The best way to handle it, there's a teaching in the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter on meditation, sixth chapter on meditation, where Krishna says that whenever you catch yourself drifting away, mind is getting distracted and is jumping around from one thought to another, you simply bring the mind back to the self. Yato yato nischarati manaschanchalamasstiram tatastato niyam yetad atmani eva vasham nayet. That's the slokam, where the mind, when you catch yourself drifting from one place to another, rather than getting discouraged by it, you simply invite the mind back to the self. That's it. Maybe for a few moments, the mind will be with the self and it will again start jumping around. Be okay with it. Give the freedom for the mind to be distracted because it's the nature of the mind. And when you catch yourself again, the next time when you catch yourself, the mind getting distracted, simply do the same thing. Bring the mind back to the self. Keep on doing it as a mechanical practice. Mechanically keep doing. And in due course of time, what we have done is we have built up this samskara or the habit of bringing the mind back to the self. And there comes a time where the mind naturally resides in the self. It doesn't need any more pushing or prodding or trying to bring it back. The mind naturally resides in the self. And that is when meditation becomes natural, effortless. It simply happens without trying to control the mind and bring it back to the self again and again. So, till that time is reached, you simply handle the mind straying away from the self by inviting the mind back to the self.
And that makes sense. And I think the key point here is to make sure that you're not actively fighting with these thoughts, right? But rather letting them just come in and then go. And I think, like you mentioned, Shriramji, at some point, right, when you can kind of think of these, this sounds very abstract, of course, but you can kind of think of these thoughts as, having their own sort of, timeline or horizon. And so when they come in, if the more you engage with them, the more they're going to stay in your mind. But if you just are able to kind of detach yourself to a certain extent possible from those thoughts, you will then find that they probably will come in, but then slowly leave in a way where they don't have that much of an issue anymore, and you're able to find yourself consciously avoiding them and ignoring them. So that's important to note. The next point, the next lever, and maybe we'll pick up the pace a little bit, just given that we have about half more to cover. But how should we think about engagement with the world in our daily life, influencing meditation, Shriramji? So I guess first, what does that mean? And second of all, what is the application of that?
So what we do outside the yoga mat has a big influence on the quality of the meditation when we sit inside the yoga mat. And as we saw before, the food that we eat, how much we eat and what we eat has a big influence on the quality of meditation. How we conduct our life. For example, in the Ashtanga Yoga, Patanjali gives some guidance. For example, the yamas and niyamas, living a life of ethics, honesty, integrity, truthfulness, and ahimsa, non-violence, etc. So when we abide by these rules, where we are true to ourselves, true to our conscience, if we could say that, then when we sit for meditation, there is no inner conflict. You see, otherwise, if we, for example, have hurt somebody because of our angry words, then perhaps when we sit for meditation, there is some regret or guilt that is inside, that is poking our consciousness, and that will surface into our awareness when we sit for meditation. Because in a state of meditation, we become very keenly sensitive to all these thoughts, the seeds that are lurking in the mind. So when we live our life in a way that is in line with ethics, honesty, integrity, non-violence, etc., the yamas and niyamas, then when we sit for meditation, there is no inner conflict, there is no regret, there is no guilt. As they say, if we don't like something, we don't want to go near it, right? If we don't like ourselves because maybe I'm not proud of what I said the previous day to somebody, I hurt somebody's feelings. If I don't like myself because of what I said, then the mind doesn't want to repose in the self, you see, because there is a conflict there, there is a regret or a guilt there. So when we are at peace with ourselves, the way we conduct our life, then it becomes easy for the mind to be with the self. It naturally reposes, resides within the self. So there are many things we can do, like our lifestyle. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says that be aware of the food habits, not eat too much, do not starve yourself as well, take the middle path. Same thing with activities, do not avoid actions and become lazy. At the same time, do not be a workaholic, choose the middle path. So when there's a balance between the extremes, that creates the perfect space for the meditation to blossom uh, into a very deep experience. So what we do outside the yoga mat definitely has an influence of the quality of meditation inside the yoga mat. And incidentally, the reverse is also true. When we practice meditation, the way in which we engage with the world, the way in which we conduct our life, also there is a big transformation there. We are able to live a life that is more in tune with our core intentions. We become a more kind, more compassionate being, and we're always kind to others because the mind is at peace and so forth.
And that makes sense. So thanks for sharing that, Shriramji. Maybe the next topic, right? The practice of simplicity. So how does that apply here in meditation?
So as the theme suggests, it's very simple. When we complicate our life and the mind has to manage a big matrix of multitasking. So when we sit for meditation, for example, there's a big list of to-do items. I need to do this, this, this. When the mind is caught up in the complexity of our life, then perhaps the mind doesn't settle down. And in my teacher used to say, simple living but high thinking. Simple living but high thinking. In other words, when we bring simplicity in our life, this is related actually to the practice of Aparigraha. Aparigraha means non-accumulation of lot of stuff. This is based on the fact that yogis have discovered we don't need a great deal of stuff that we need to acquire in order to be happy. We can be happy with very few things. When we look at what are the physical requirements to be happy, in fact, it's very few. When we complicate our life, when we bring too much stuff, then in order to manage them, in order to keep track of all of them, when we make this matrix of things to do, things to manage very big, then perhaps it interferes with the practice of meditation because the mind is still caught up in all the practical aspects of life, which has gone out of hand. So when we live a simple life, simple living, high thinking, that means we are able to shut off from the world and go deep into meditation. It becomes a far easier process.
Makes sense. So thanks for sharing that. That I think relates really well to the concept of meditation, which is probably all about simplicity and just silencing everything. So makes complete sense. The next key, right? Yearning for a higher ideal. So how should we think about that higher goal, Shriramji? And is that maybe a tool for us to use to also partially block out all other invading thoughts?
Yes, that is one aspect. So we can think of this point, yearning for a higher ideal, in two ways. The first is when we have a goal, a life goal, for example, that is bigger than ourselves. When we align ourselves with a bigger cause, not just caught up in our mundane day-to-day activities, but aligning our thoughts and intentions to some higher ideal. What we are doing is that whenever the mind is filled with trivial or mundane thoughts, it is easier to let go of them, not get trapped by small little thoughts, because our mind is now seeking something higher. It is like in the presence of the sun, you don't need a candle. You don't see, there's no value in having a lot of candles when the sun is shining very bright. Like that, when there's a higher goal, a worthy goal that we have aligned our mind, our intentions, our sankalpa towards, then all these trivial thoughts, they will not dislodge the mind from that stability. We'll not get caught up in all these distractions because the mind has a direction. When the mind has a single pointed direction, it is easier for the mind to settle down. In other words, we can say it this way: it is easier for a one pointed mind to settle down in meditation rather than a scattered mind settling down in meditation. So, having this higher cause or a higher calling where we are aligning ourselves towards help us to unite all the aspects of the mind in what is called ekagrata. That means one pointed stream of thoughts. And in fact, that is the practice of dharana. And perhaps that is why dharana appears one limb before dhyana in the Ashtanga Yoga practice. With the practice of dharana, where we bring the mind to one pointed focus, it becomes easy for the mind to settle down in meditation after that. So that is one aspect of aligning, yearning for a higher cause. There's also one more facet to it, namely, with the practice of meditation, we are actually giving life to some of the latent powers that we have. In other words, meditation awakens some of the powers of the mind that we didn't know we had. The mind becomes more powerful. We are able to use our creativity and intuition. Meditation awakens the powers of creativity and intuition. So, how do you channel that? Because if we have all these powers, we can bring that to a useful expression by directing all these powers to a worthy goal. So yearning for some higher ideal will help us to channelize the powers that we get by the practice of meditation, the powers of creativity and intuition.
I think that makes complete sense, and I wish it was that easy to have, the ability to suddenly just have that goal be crystal clear and then use that as a way to then block out the other thoughts. I guess that's partially something that hopefully will keep us motivated in the practice of meditation as well, because it gives us something to work towards. So maybe that's one little tidbit of wisdom that our listeners can take away in terms of goals and motivation for wanting to do meditation, is partially because if you keep this higher goal, you have the ability to then keep yourself motivated through the process, even when things maybe are a little tough or you don't feel like actually doing practice of meditation. So the last two, Shriramji, we'll quickly go through. So can we talk about the ninth key, which is basically using your actions to aligning every action towards a higher purpose? So what does that mean in the context of how it relates to meditation?
Yes, this ninth key is align our actions towards a higher purpose. This is related to one of the profound teachings in the Bhagavad Gita that says, Yogastha Kuru Karmani. That means be in a space of yoga, be in the state of yoga, and then allow actions to express themselves. Be in yoga first, or be in the place of happiness or the bliss first, and then express your actions rather than reversing the order. In the words of one of my teachers, Sri Ravi Shankarji, he says it very beautifully. Use actions as an expression of joy rather than expectation of joy. So when we examine how we use our actions, many times we use actions because I'm not happy now. If I do this action, I will acquire an object or this experience or this state or this benefit, and then I will be happy. So in this example, we are using action as an expectation of joy. We are expecting joy through our actions. Whereas if you're already happy, then we use actions in a totally different way. We use actions as an expression of joy. And this is far superior. This type of action is far superior. And when we practice meditation, what happens is, because we repose in ourselves, and as we seen before, the true happiness resides in the self. So when we are in touch with the true place of happiness, we can use actions to express that happiness. And when we align all our actions as an expression of joy and allow these actions to direct towards a higher purpose or a higher goal, we are again giving an expression to the benefits that we accrue in meditation.
Very nicely said, Shriramji. I think that using the actions to express the highest version of yourself, right, is something that we probably strive towards. That's like the ultimate state of being, if you will, right? And that's when you've really been able to probably hit what that idealistic version of living resembles and looks like. So hopefully, and the practice of meditation makes sense in that context, because you can also use meditation as a tool to be able to further crystallize your thoughts and really understand and get enlightened, right? Which then allows you to translate that towards your actions. So I think that is really nicely put. So the last lever, really quickly, seeking people, right, who will inspire you. So how do we think about that, especially when it comes to the concept of practicing meditation, and what should that be?
So this is a very powerful key as well. Namely, in the presence of one who is peaceful, you might have noticed that one's own mind also becomes peaceful. And in the Yoga Sutras also, Patanjali says that ahimsa pratisthayam tatsannidhau vairatyagaha. That means in the presence of one who is living non-violence. That means they're always kind. They never hurt anybody. So in the presence of one who is always kind, any angry thoughts in one's mind will simply disappear. So they reflect that same kindness in their own mind. Same thing with a peaceful mind. A person who is established in peace, in tranquility, anybody else who are in their vicinity, in the presence of such a person whose mind is peaceful, then others' mind also becomes very peaceful. So we can actually make use of this, the presence of those who are peaceful. We can think of it as those people who inspire you with the power of their meditation. You see? So their mind is already peaceful. And when we practice meditation in their presence, or just be around them, then our mind also becomes peaceful. So this is the power of having a guru, a person whose mind is already tranquil, and in their presence, our mind also becomes very quiet. It is like a lit candle can light multiple other candles. So we are making use of the peace and tranquility that is already there. We are leveraging that and bringing the peace and tranquility in our own mind as well, just by being in their presence.
And I think at the very least, that at least gives us the motivation and the inspiration, right, to work towards that more idealistic state of being and towards that ideal meditative state. So that I think that concludes the 10 keys of meditation strategy. So I know we went through it pretty fast for our listeners, but I think hopefully that gives a sense of what are the key tenets of meditation that you should think about kind of incorporating or just contemplating when it comes to the practice of meditation. So thank you, Shriramji, once again for taking the time to really nicely walk through all these different components and how we should be thinking about them, especially applying them practically into our daily lives. So with that, why don't maybe we go ahead and conclude for today, but I will turn it back to you, Shriramji, in case you have any last few words of wisdom you'd like to share on this topic with our listeners.
Thank you, Vedantji. And again, I would just like to remind all of us that meditation occupies a central place in the practice of yoga. So yoga is much more than just practices for the body or even the breath. And the main event in the yoga sadhana, in the practice of yoga, is the state of tranquility of the mind. And the practice that comes closest to this objective is dhyana or meditation. So uh, I would highly recommend that all of us uh, give this value to the practice of meditation and invite this practice in our daily life. Do not ignore meditation, but use the power of meditation. And this has so many benefits to offer, including physical benefits and benefits for the mind, where we feel better, more peaceful, more tranquil, and more creative, etc. So this is a very powerful practice, and it is not just for oneself. We also benefit others with our meditation because we present to them a more peaceful version of ourselves. We are presenting to the people whose lives we touch the highest version of ourselves, a more kind, more peaceful, and more happy version of ourselves.
Wonderful. So with that, thank you once again, Shriramji, for taking the time to wonderfully explain these different concepts. And hopefully our listeners and our audience found this to be a helpful session. So with that, why don't we go ahead and conclude for today. And thank you again to our listeners for going to the podcast. Hopefully you're finding it helpful, and we will see you again for the next episode in the near future.
Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you.